It was a June evening that smelled like summer grass and ordinary trouble. A mother walked with her 10-year-old son toward a locked front door. She knocked. She called for the woman inside to come out. The reply came not in words but in a single gunshot fired through the door, through wood and bone. The mother fell. The child stood frozen. A neighborhood became a courtroom.
For a walk, isn't it?
A country began to argue, and a law meant to protect people would be asked to explain what it had. Aloud. Please help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. This is the story of a locked door, a contested law, and the life that ended on the threshold. This is Stand Your Ground. Law, race, and a locked door. Ajike, called Ajike by those who loved her, was 35 years old. She was a mother of 4, a woman who parented children through scraped knees, school mornings, and the quiet homework hours of the evening. To friends and family she was fierce, warm, and entirely human, someone whose days were arranged around work, family, and the small dignities of raising children in a tight-knit neighborhood. Across the yard lived Susan, a neighbor who, over time, had become visibly agitated by what she perceived as threats to her property and peace. The two had neighbors' disputes, arguments about children playing, complaints, calls to law enforcement. Those small frictions, the kind that flare and then fade in many communities, did not fade here. Instead, they escalated, built up like tension in a wound, and on a humid night in June, the wound opened. The neighborhood, a subdivision in Marion County, Florida, had been the stage for months of back and forth, repeated 911 phone calls, noticeable tension between adults, and mounting frustration felt on both sides. Public records and bodycam footage later would show the Marion County Sheriff's Office responding to complaints and disputes between the neighbors time and again, a pattern that would become critical to how this story was told and judged. To understand what happened at the door, we need to understand how ordinary grievances stacked into something combustible, where fear, anger, and law would meet. It was the evening of June 2nd, 2023. Night had fallen early. Lights glowed behind curtains. Ajike, concerned after an altercation involving her children in a grassy area near the homes, walked toward Susan's house with her son at her side. Witnesses later would describe the scene as tense but not violent. A mother trying to confront a neighbor she believed had harmed or threatened her child. She reached the front of the house, a door without windows that separated one life from another. She knocked. She called, loud enough for a yard to hear. On the other side of the door, Susan Lorincz claimed she heard pounding, an assault on a threshold. She would later tell investigators she feared the door would be forced, that she thought she and perhaps the people inside her home were in immediate danger. The testimonies diverge here. Some witnesses said the knocking was a call for accountability, a mother demanding answers. Others, including Lorincz, later said the knocking was aggressive and frightening. With that fear came action. Through the closed, locked door, a gun was fired. A single round. The bullet traveled through the door at close range, struck Ajike in the chest, and she collapsed in front of her child. The boy, 10 years old, watched as his mother fell, as a life ended in the porch light. Emergency calls were made. Deputies were already en route for an earlier disturbance in the area when another call signaled gunfire. First responders found Ajike on the ground. She was rushed to a hospital but did not survive. The world of her children, and of a family that had known her as mother, daughter, and friend, was altered irreparably. In the hours and days afterward, photographs and bodycam footage began to circulate. The empty porch, the indentation where a life once stood, the small shoes of a child left behind. Every image amplified the question: was this an act of self-defense or an act of deadly overreaction? The investigation that followed would lean heavily on evidence that appeared simple at first glance: a locked door, a single bullet, a knocked threshold, but which, under scrutiny, raised many complexities. Detectives collected statements, examined the physical evidence, and reviewed the cascade of 911 calls and police body cam audio that had, until that night, chronicled the neighborhood's unease. Forensics established the trajectory: close range, fired through the door. Ballistics and door forensics would later be used to challenge, corroborate accounts. The presence of the child beside Ajike when the shot struck added the emotional weight to the investigation, but also complicated legal interpretations about threat and imminence. Investigators cataloged prior calls, the pattern of complaints and incidents that framed the context, and those records would be central. At trial, officers interviewed neighbors, family members, and both women. Neighbors described years of friction. Some recounted Lorincz calling police repeatedly about children playing near her home. Others described occasions where tempers flared but violence did not follow. These histories would become the scaffolding on which jurors and the public tried to place motives and fear. Lorincz claimed self-defense, relying on her perception of an imminent threat. In Florida, the Stand Your Ground doctrine, a law that removes the duty to retreat in situations where a person reasonably believes deadly force is necessary, had become a flashpoint in public debate for years. It provides legal space for defendants to argue they acted out of fear for their safety without needing to attempt to retreat. Whether that doctrine applied to the facts of a gun fired through a locked door would be central to courtroom arguments. Prosecutors, however, argued that the shooting was not an act of reasonable fear but an act fueled by anger and long-standing animus, an overreach of force against a woman who, by the evidence, posed no imminent lethal threat. The question the investigators, and later the jury, had to answer: was the fear real and reasonable? Or was it a post hoc justification for lethal force? As evidence mounted, so did public scrutiny. Community activists, attorneys, and media began to pick apart police transcripts, sheriff's reports, and body cam footage. The narrative swung between empathy for a frightened homeowner and fierce defense of a mother taken from her children. The investigation was not merely about physical evidence. It quickly became a contest over narrative, race, and power. The trial brought the private tensions of a neighborhood into public view. Witnesses testified to what they had seen and heard that June night. Emotional testimony from Ajike's family described the life, her hopes, her routine, her role as a mother, and the void her absence created. Defense witnesses painted a portrait of a woman who felt threatened, who had repeatedly engaged law enforcement, and who believed that when danger was at her door she had the right to protect herself. The prosecution called the pattern of prior complaints as evidence of motive and context. They framed the shooting as avoidable and fueled by frustration rather than immediate peril. The jury considered the physical evidence and the human testimony. They considered whether a reasonable person in Lorincz's position would have believed deadly force necessary. In the end, the jury found Lorincz guilty of manslaughter. The conviction signaled that the jurors did not accept the self-defense argument as a full exoneration. The verdict raised new questions for the public and legal scholars alike. Where is the line between fear and anger, between precaution and punishment? Who gets to define reasonable fear, and how do race and community context influence that definition? In November 2024, after months of pretrial proceedings and an August conviction, the judge sentenced Susan Locrinz to 25 years in the custody of the Florida Department of Corrections. The sentence reflected the gravity of taking a life at a moment that the court concluded did not meet the legal threshold for justified deadly force. The judge, while acknowledging concerns about mental health and history, emphasized that the fatal shot was driven by anger, not lawful fear. For Ajike's children, The sentence could not conjure a mother back to the dinner table or replace the bedtime stories that were stolen that night. For the community, it represented both closure for some and an insufficient answer for others who see the decision as part of a larger system in need of reform. Public reactions were strong and varied: protests, calls for policy change, and deep conversations on television and in living rooms about how laws like stand your ground operate in practice. The case also points to systemic debates: how self-defense laws are applied and whether they are applied equally across racial lines. Critics argued that racial bias, the tendency in some cases to afford greater credibility or perceived threat to certain demographics, can pervade decisions about who is seen as dangerous and who is seen as vulnerable. Supporters of strict self-defense rights argued the law is essential for civilians' protection. The Lorincz case became one of those tragic touchpoints where law, race, and public sentiment collided. The shooting also drew media attention that would later be crystallized into documentary film. Filmmakers utilized bodycam footage and public records to assemble a narrative that put the neighborhood's daily rhythms and tensions on screen. The documentary not only amplified Owens's humanity but also interrogated how institutions responded before and after the killing, pressing viewers to ask what might have been prevented with different interventions. Numbers. Verdicts cannot hold grief. Ajike's family, her children, her mother, her friends were left to pick up the unspeakable. They gave interviews, they spoke at vigils, and they organized, turning personal tragedy into public testimony. Out of their grieving came advocacy, funds, foundations, and calls to revisit how communities can be protected from similar tragedies. The image of a child on a porch has been seared into collective memory, a reminder that every legal argument hides human beings. On the other side, friends and family of Lorincz described a person struggling with a pattern of paranoia and conflict, someone who firmly believed she was in danger. The sentence did not erase their belief that fear had motivated her actions, but the law had found otherwise. These are not two neatly opposed sides, but rather overlapping circles of sorrow, conviction, and confusion. Florida's Stand Your Ground law is emblematic of broader legal questions across America. When does the right to defend oneself become a license to use deadly force preemptively? The law removes a duty to retreat, but it does not remove the requirement that force be reasonable and necessary. The application of that reasonableness standard depends on human judgment, on jurors, on judges, and crucially on how a community interprets threat. Critics of current self-defense jurisprudence argue that the reasonable person is not a neutral standard. It is interpreted through the lenses of race, class, and power. In this case, many observers raised alarms that a black mother who approached a neighbor's door did not receive the same presumption of non-threat as a white person in a similar circumstance might. Laws are frameworks for human life. But laws are not stories. They are applied by people in contexts thick with history, fear, and bias. A locked door stopped a family from sleeping together that night, and it opened a national conversation about how we decide who may use deadly force and under what circumstances. Ask yourself, in a society that promises safety, who are we protecting and at what cost? When a knock on a door becomes a life-ending moment, the answer is not only legal, it is moral, personal, and painfully human. If you found this story meaningful, consider supporting community programs that work to reduce violence and help families in grief. And when you walk past your neighbor's porch tonight, listen.